Art, I have to begin with you. 20 states and D.C. Of course, some of this stuff was already baked into the cake because these increases in the minimum wage are indexed to inflation. But a further 9 states took the step. Refresh my memory and those of our viewers. Why is it that, in your opinion, raising the minimum wage is a terrible idea?
Well, let me just say that it is a state idea, and I think states have a perfect right to raise the minimum wage politically and reflect their own electorate. The reason I think so is because I think it's a bad idea, especially in a slow economy like we have, is because the impact of raising the minimum wage on especially the poorest, the disadvantaged minorities in the inner cities especially, but also in the farms in Kentucky and places like that, are the biggest people who face the down burden of that. If you look at employment to population of, let's say, black teenagers in the inner city, you find that their employment to population is really low and has been, low by any historical standards. And this is the only way they can really come into the mainstream is by getting a good high-paying job. They didn't go to a prep school like I did, or Yale like I did, or get their PhD like I did. They've got to get the minimum wage by earning the requisite skills to earn that minimum wage, and by precluding them from that first job, they become unemployed for years and then become unemployable and then hostile. This is not a good policy for bringing people into the mainstream of the economy. That's my view. States have a perfect right, however, to do whatever the heck they want.
Peter, there is a spectrum of views on the minimum wage, and where would you say Art falls relative to other economists, and what is the argument that the others make for raising it?
So Art is expressing a view that's been around for decades and decades, and for a long time it was pretty much accepted wisdom in the economics profession. But starting in the 1980s, people started. So let's just, instead of just going by the theory here, let's go look at the data and find out what has happened in places where minimum wages rose. And the finding was that what the textbooks tell you doesn't necessarily turn out to be the case in real life, that you could actually raise the minimum wage without having deleterious effects on overall employment. Now, that's not to say that the effects Art's talking about there don't exist. They certainly do. There could be a change in the composition of who works, for example. But yes, the idea that you get to sort of, we're at 725 now, right, federal? A lot of states are already above that. We're not seeing terrible effects on those states that have gone above 725. So how high can we go? That's unknown. And I would say that some of the places that are going to $13, $15 an hour, that's kind of getting into crazy territory. I would worry about that. But something in the range of, say, 1010, which is what President Obama is seeking, seems like, hey, let's give it a try.
Art?
Eric? Yeah, let me just say that, minimum wage has very different impacts on populations depending upon the rate of economic growth and on the cost of living. For example, in New York City, a minimum wage of $10.10 is probably half the minimum wage of what it would be in Kentucky at $7 because of the cost of living in different groups of people working. Right. So I really think it's very important that if a minimum wage does go through, it is done by state level. It really should not be a federal minimum wage. There's one other which I think I tried to allude to, and I am very, very concerned about the lowest echelon of the U.S. economy, and especially on minorities coming into the mainstream of economics. I do think that the minimum wage has an enormously distorted effect on the inner city, on teenagers, on minorities. I really think those people don't have a chance of coming into the mainstream if they never can get a first job. And that's what's really happening here. And lastly, I remember when...
Can I just stop you for just
sure,
one second?
Please, of course.
What you just articulated there, is that what you meant about a year ago when you made the comment that became somewhat controversial, that the minimum wage is effectively a Teenage Black Unemployment Act?
Of course it is. It has the biggest impact on minority teenagers in the inner cities. That's where these are the kids who really actually work at the minimum wage. They're the ones that get hammered by it. And if you look at the employment of those people, it's shocking. It's not a racist remark. It has a very, very impact by minority groups in this country and by age. And anyone who doesn't see that doesn't see reality.
Okay, Art, I think that is a really important point you're raising there. It's a tough one to deal with because you don't know what to do. It's like, yes, we don't want to exclude people from getting that first rung on the ladder. On the other hand, we want to dignify work by making sure that people get paid for what they do.
Peter, let me answer you. We do have an answer, I think, to it. Enterprise zones and especially those depressed areas, and don't make it a minimum wage. Make it a federal government wage supplement that goes to the worker rather than having a higher wage, which would impact the employer. These employers, in general, are not rich people. So if you raise the minimum wage, it really impacts their business and their ability to hire. So if you want to raise the minimum wage, use a wage supplement. Don't make a minimum wage. That means that all the burden is on the employers.
I'm having a little bit of trouble reconciling what you just said with the Art Laffer I thought I knew. You're advocating distortive economic federal tax policy. Shouldn't,
of course,
everybody be treated the same way?
Well, if they're all in the same circumstances, of course they should. But if they're not in the same circumstances, we have a real problem in our inner cities. I worked at the University of Chicago, and I lived in the south side of Chicago. That's a separate problem, independent of Manhattan. Believe me when I tell you that. So my proposal back in 1974-75 was to have an enterprise zone where we have no payroll tax, a very lower income tax, no minimum wage in the inner cities, so that we can really instill private economic growth in those areas without burdening the employers. And what the minimum wage does is it takes these low-wage employers and really hammers them, because every dollar the minimum wage worker gets more, the employer of that minimum wage gets less.
Hey, Art,
if we want to make this a policy, make it government subsidized.
Art, I think one thing we can probably agree on is that the minimum wage is not a cure-all. It's not a silver bullet. There's no way that a minimum wage alone is going to solve the problem of low incomes in this country. People who are unemployed, for example, don't benefit from the minimum wage. But maybe it's part of a package. For example, couple it with the earned income tax credit. Couple it with vouchers for housing, with food stamps. There are a variety of pieces of the safety net, which I would argue maybe the minimum wage is one.
Yeah, but I wouldn't. But this paternalistic approach of this subsidies and food stamps and all these others, give them the money. You know, rather than trying to tell them what to buy and how to buy it with it and use all these earned income tax credits, etc., give them the money for employment. If they're making $5 an hour from their employer and you want to supplement that to $10 an hour, use government spending, not the tax system. That's what government spending is supposed to do.
Art, I have a simple question.
Yes.
If states weren't raising the minimum wage, let's just assume for a moment that the entire country was operating at a $7.25 an hour minimum wage, and we didn't have places like Seattle, for example, or states like Rhode Island introducing their own minimum wages, where would the unemployment rate be?
Well, the unemployment rate now would be much, much higher in places like Kentucky and very, very low cost of living states. I mean, there you'll find a very large proportion of the employed population working at the minimum wage or lower, and it will have very little employment impact on places like New York or Connecticut, where the cost of living is very, very high. You know, the minimum wage to livable wage in New York is much, much higher than a livable wage, let's say, in Kentucky. And you've got to reflect these cost of living differences. Now, one other thing that's just really important, if you're in North Dakota where the unemployment rate is 2% or 2.5%,
and rising at the moment.
Well, the minimum, it will rise a lot with the oil prices dropping. But outside of that, a minimum wage in very fast-growing areas has very little impact on employment. But a minimum wage in very slow areas, stagnant areas, has a very large impact. So you've got to reflect on the cost of living, on economic growth, and also on the demographics of who's being impacted by it. And this just irritates me enormously when I see people talking about it in a broad scale, and they don't really realize who's going to bear the full brunt of this. These are people, our future. And we're denying them really the access to the economic system. I find that offensive, to be honest with you.